I'm Erica Ensign.
And I'm Lisa Schmeiser.
And we welcome you back to the saga of rereading epics, in which we are rereading, reconsidering, and refeeling Julian May's Saga of Pliocene Exile and Galactic Milieu series. For this episode, we have arrived firmly in the Galactic Milieu trilogy after the interregnum that was Intervention. That's right, we have read Jack the Bodiless. We've reached the saint. Well, he's not a saint yet. What do you think, Lisa?
It's like the saint's origin story. That's what this book is.
It is, yeah. When they got to the point where, like, he was born on Epiphany, I was like, okay, here we go.
I have so many thoughts.
Well, speaking of those thoughts, where do you want to start to dive into this epic tome? They're long these days, these books.
These books are really long. They're basically the perfect nerd beach read.
Yeah.
Because if you were like, I want a book that has family trees and a vividly described extended universe with multiple aliens and multiple cultures and the extrapolation of radical social changes, but I want it to be a rip-roaring read and highly entertaining, this is your book. This is your jam.
Yeah, I will say right off the top that I was surprised. I have not been looking forward to this trilogy so much because I remembered not loving it the first time through. And basically all of the little bits and pieces that I remembered of the trilogy happened in this book, which is not surprising. And I really enjoyed it. I don't know if it's because you and I have been talking about each one of these books as we go, and I have noticed so many more things, but I did find it to be a rip-roaring read. As you said, I wasn't expecting that, and it kind of took me by surprise. So I just enjoyed it, and I just zipped right on through it. Yeah.
It's a mashup of so many different genres. Because you have it's a little bit of a mystery puzzle box, because the book begins, as they all do, with Uncle Rogi having to protesting having to write his memoirs.
Yes.
Because that was something that we saw in the previous two books that we talked about. And here we check in with him. He's skiing. There's a reference to habitant pea soup, which is a callback to the Pliocene epic, where you find out that Mark has a cache he's been working his way through.
Yeah, that's right.
But when I went back, I reread the book once, like just in a great big gulp all in the course of a day. And then went back and reread it again slowly. And I thought, you've got like a gothic potboiler in here with the origin of fury. I'm born inevitably. And you have, again, like a slow unspooling mystery with who is Fury. It's a murder mystery. You've got that going on. And you've got some rip-roaring action and spy sequences, both with Jack's birth and then with Mark's mysterious motorbike hobby that he has. And you've got like a talky-feely New England college campus type novel that's going on. And you've got kind of like a C.S. Lewis light with the meaning of morality type of thing, and a little bit of a ghost story at the same time. And it works. Like, that's the lunatic thing, is you've got all these different elements. And like and I'd say even like throw in like 3 trashy bestsellers about the Kennedy dynasty and stir. And that's about it. Because like this is basically, we've got the French Canadian Kennedys out of New Hampshire.
Yeah. You're right.
They're all psychic and they run the world.
Speaking of soup, this is like a soup that's got like just a whole bunch of different ingredients that are floating together and swirling around, and like it does come together really, really tastily. And and I think each part, maybe with a few exceptions, but for the most part, each part is good enough on its own that I would be interested in the novella that dives deeper into, Mark and his buddies on campus and what campus is like. And I would, even more information about what Rogi and Teresa got up to while they were, their day to day, like it's almost Little House on the Prairie style. Like this is.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. We whittle a bench and, all those things. I would like to dive into each of them even deeper. And I'm not saying she should have done that in this book, not at all, because she shouldn't have, because that would have been too much.
It was a great balance. Yeah.
But she did a great job at bringing each of those different types of stories to life, so that I was interested in more.
Like, chapter 1 is your foreshadowing chapter where he has the dream, and it kind of sets the tone for the big themes that you're going to get through the entire series. And she lays down lots of clues. We're not going to spoil the rest of the books the way we felt kind of comfortable doing with the Pliocene epic and the other ones, because it's a lot more fun just to read along if you don't remember who Fury is or what happens with Mental Man or any of that. Yeah. But I will say that Chapter 1 is basically setting the tone for the whole trilogy and a lot of the central conflicts. But for me, the book really takes off with the super creepy, super great Chapter 2, which is the chapter where Dennis makes them all stand around Victor's comatose body and say and like pray for him on Good Friday. And this is this routine that he makes them do every single year. And you basically get an update on what's been happening in the family. And the answer is Dennis and Lucille had a boatload of kids. Dennis has the immortality gene, but Lucille does not. So she is off stage for this particular chapter. All of the adults and all of their spouses have come to hold a vigil around Victor's bedside. And at the moment that he dies, he reaches a malign force pops up and tries to take hold of Rogi. And surrender to me, I'm Fury, I'm born inevitably. And Rogi is somehow saved by a force that he doesn't know or quite comprehend at the time. Fury says, I require assistance, and I'll take you to start with. Silly, flawed old Rogi, but you'll be useful. And then another voice pops in and says, he's mine. You may not have Rogi. Do what you must do, but not with him. And, like, the first time I read that, like, way back when I first read the book, I'm like, who would have stood up for Rogi? What's going on? And then I realized, like, later on, it's Mark. Mark is a Lilmlick who's gone back to this horrible origin story event that traumatized his family for decades. And rather than act, the only thing he does is save Rogi and say, okay, the rest of it has to happen. And it's such a biblical scene.
And it's
and
like
that really sets a scene. Yeah.
Yeah. And it shows us that, like, you know, we were talking about all the way through Intervention, how Rogi is like this sort of tentpole character. All of the other things sort of like rely upon him in some way. And this is a clear indication that is not going to cease for this book. Like right off the bat here, we've got the ghost saving him because he is still needed to perform other duties.
Mm-hmm. Silly, flawed old Rogi, but you'll be useful. And, you know, I think what I love about that is because that's basically how the whole family sees him. Yeah. And, but they don't realize how useful he is. They never do. Mm-hmm. This whole chapter is so creepy. And then when Victor dies in the chapter, he takes his siblings with him.
I know. Like, you think the whole chapter, it builds up to, you know, he's alive and conscious, but can't reach out in any way. So, like, you are given this thought that he is powerless all the way through. And then at the end, he manages to take, you know, his siblings who have been waiting on him all these years along with him. It's like, I guess he wasn't as powerless as we thought. Or
did he install some sort of suicidal failsafe in their subconsciouses?
Maybe while he was still with it.
Because we know that he, did like Skinner conditioning on them so that they weren't operant. And my suspicion is after that horrible, heartbreaking incident where he was getting ready to marry Pauline off to the to the sadist, and she tells her brother, and they escape him via suicide. Maybe he went back and planted subliminal suiciding triggers in his other siblings to make sure no one could ever escape his grasp. And the triggers just weren't activated because he was locked inside his mind for so many years.
That I would not put that past Victor. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that he would do. There were a couple other things in this chapter that I noticed were really interesting. One was just all this talk about Dennis's guilt. And, you know, his guilt, I think, is for letting Vic live originally as much as it is for keeping him alive all this time, which is, I mean, that's a heavy burden to sort of start a book off with, of this talk about this deep guilt that he's feeling for the existence of his brother and the existence of his brother, you know, how much of that rests on his own soul. We never really get a real answer about it, but I like the fact that it's discussed right at the beginning here.
I also I highlighted this passage because I wanted to, once you read through, you realize, oh, this is one of her pet themes she's going to come back to, where we talk about, it talks about Victor and Dennis's father, Donnie, and I'm going to read the passage real quick, and it says, Rogi closed his eyes. Immediately, a deluge of memories seemed to engulf him. He seemed to see again his twin brother Donnie, whose juvenile assaults on his mind, non-malicious in the beginning, had prompted Rogi the spontaneous development of strong mental shielding. Only once had the two of them conjoined in a self-defensive, triumphant metaconcert. But after that, seeking to renew the experience, Donnie had instead attempted to violate Rogi's self, make the two of them into an inseparable whole. When Rogi refused, Donnie hated him and hated himself for the hating until the day he died. And this idea of refusing to surrender and the resentment and the hate, we see over the course of this book, we see what happens when five minds get directed in malicious metaconcert by fury, but we also see how there's always this tension between collaborative work and stubborn individualism. Mm-hmm. And that is a theme that she loves and comes back to again and again and again.
Yeah, and it seems like rugged individualism has a tendency to win out over collaboration a lot of the time.
In this book, yeah, more or less. And that's one of the central tensions, I think, in the book, because there's also a passage late in the book that I highlighted because it really struck me as dissonant and odd. But like over the course, Mark Remillard, as a teenager, helps his mother escape from like effectively the One Galactic government, so she can go have a baby who's going to be full of genetic anomalies. And the reason this is considered a crime is because the Galactic Polity has a whole bunch of laws about reproductive statutes. And the idea is if you have a pregnancy or you're carrying a child who is going to be miserable, in pain, die, perhaps not even survive the pregnancy, you'll just have a quick early abortion. Jack, who we're talking about here, is filled with genetic anomalies. So, of course, he should, in theory, be aborted. Teresa is convinced that he's, like, super duper psychic. And so she goes off the grid to have the baby in secret and figures it's better to ask forgiveness and permission, qua the illegitimate baby. Mark, as a teenager, helps his mom do this, becomes closer to the baby than any of his other siblings or any of his cousins. And over the course of the book, though, they turn into like debate partners and sparring partners. Mm-hmm. And this, again, it's that tension that she's setting up there, because Jack's way of thinking and moving through the world is collaborative and a lot less individualistic than Mark's, because they're setting up Mark to be a rugged individualist even early on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And speaking of like the laws of the human polity and the babies and stuff like that, that was the baby thing was another thing that was touched on right in that second chapter, where we get like, I think it was just kind of an offhanded line, but it was shown to us an echo of what we discovered back in the Pliocene era, that babies that grow in their mothers have physical and psychological advantages over basically test tube babies, which was a theme that she talked about quite a bit with Aiken Drum, and having to sort of rehab him as a character because he didn't come from two actual parents. I just thought it was interesting that argument comes up again here right at the beginning of this book.
Yep. And they talk about there's 5 pregnant women standing around Victor's bed.
Mm-hmm.
And, you find out that some of the women are really not keen on,
I'm with
on the
that
perpetual
lady.
pregnancy. Yeah. No, well, it's, the one area that I noticed that May tends to shy away from, period, and this goes back to like where her head is and her sense of morality is like there's a lot of really great body horror type sci-fi you could write about being pregnant, and especially if you were pregnant with like a psychic kid. And she goes nowhere near it, whereas I'm like, oh, that's kind of a fertile, like, the thing I'd want to know about is let's say you're operant and your fetus is operant. Like, do they get you up in the middle of the night? Do you have conversations with them? Like, how I would love to know, what happens if you and your fetus have radically different personalities and you're arguing for 9 months straight and they still have the developmental brain and the body of an infant. Like, what's the emotions that are unpacked there? Where are your bodies of psychiatry and psychology that have to deal with that? And May just kind of sidesteps all of that. But again, like, I feel like the potential for body horror is really big in that, and she goes nowhere near it.
Mm-hmm. But she does also call back fairly early on to what we were talking about in our earlier episodes, just about how the parental bond is such a big deal with her. And, you know, you're talking about Mark as a teenager helping his mother escape because he has basically severed the filial bond that he has with Paul as his father for the most part. But he simply just couldn't with Teresa because I guess the mother-son bond here between the two of them is so strong that he has not been able to cast that off as much as it seems like he would like to.
Yeah. And what I found really interesting and touching, so we go through the story. Paul and Teresa have a marriage that's troubled because he's a womanizer. She's not a fan of that, so to speak. She had a series of fertility setbacks where she and Paul's genes just kept combining, and she kept having to get abortions or miscarrying. It wasn't working. She finally conceives Jack. She goes off the grid. It gets him in trouble. Their marriage recovers for a little bit and then wobbles and goes off permanently once Jack begins to get sick. And then we're just sketching her arc over the course of the story. And then Teresa, who is Jack and Mark's mother, Teresa successfully kills herself, attempts to take Jack with her.
Yeah.
But I went back and when I read that scene, because she kills herself on Christmas Eve, in keeping with the whole theme of, religiously significant holidays. And Rogie is the one who discovers her because of course he is. And, when he goes in to check on her, he sees a tall man in evening dress leaning over to kiss her forehead. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't recognize the man, but there's something familiar about him. And I will totally admit that when I read this book for the first time as a teenager, I'm like, is it Victor? Is Victor killing people? Is this how Fury works? And then like the next time, few times I reread, I was like, oh, it's Mark. It's Mark as a Lomelick going back to say goodbye to his mother because he couldn't when he was a teenager. Mm-hmm. And that is like one of the most pure and clear moments in the whole saga, if you ask me. The fact that this guy who is thousands upon thousands of years old and has engineered a holocaust of millions upon millions, like somehow manages to attain the wisdom and perspective to be able to go back and finally say goodbye to his dead mother.
Yep.
So I really loved that moment. And then Mark, of course, is the one who's responsible for helping lay her to rest in Hawaii, where part of her disembodied soul is atoning for her trying to carry Jack off this mortal coil with her. So it's an interesting and complicated relationship, and I feel bad for Mark over the course of this book because while that's going on, his favorite person in the world, his best friend and mental rival, is busy dying of like 1,000 different types of cancer. Mm-hmm. 5 of his cousins have banded together to become the Hydra and try to kill him repeatedly. No. Fury is intruding on his dreams. His dad is faffed off to another planet with his mistress.
Yeah, it's like we know that he is going to go on to do terrible, terrible things. But like in this book, he is getting the short end of the stick left, right, and center. It's like kind of no wonder he turns into such a rugged individualist,
He's a teenager.
Angry young man.
Yeah. I mean, he's a teenager. And I think like one of the things that I wonder about this book, and this is a fun tangent we can go off in just a moment, but one of the things I wonder about in this book was Julian May raising teenagers at the time when she wrote this? I don't know. Is this why she's like, they're intelligent and I want nothing to do with them, let's send them off planet?
Yeah, I mean, there are moments where, like, Mark is just callous as hell. So when he is on Concilium Orb and when he first gets there and he's like, I need to leave, I need to go back because I have to feed Teresa and Rogie or they're going to die. He is perfectly fine with stealing a ship and like screwing with the minds of everybody on the crew and hopefully not killing anybody. Like to him, it's more important to protect his family than it is to respect the sovereignty of however many people happen to be on the spaceship. And I found that moment really chilling in terms of who he is as a character. He has his moments of warmth, certainly later when he becomes a Lilmic. But yeah, at this point, it's just like, yeah, this kid's not quite a sociopath, but we're getting there.
Well, there's like two lines that Rogie says to assess Mark, where one of them is, he had no doubt that Mark was the most highly endowed of the lot. He also suspected the boy might be the most marginally human of them. And for that reason, Rogie had always taken special pains to reach out to him, not always with success. From infancy, Mark had contrived to hide behind a barrier of nearly perfect control and self-containment. More unfortunately, there was something about the boy's mindset that reminded the old man of his late nemesis, Victor Remillard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's also the moment too where we get the people who are joining up to become rebels, like that cadre of people is sort of grouping together. And I think it's Adrian, Mark's uncle, who suggests that someday Mark would be a good leader because his mind is so powerful. And I'm like, the idea that the person who's going to be your leader is simply going to be your leader because he has a powerful mind. Like, that's just very problematic to me in terms of a hierarchical structure for any kind of organization. I don't want the most powerful person at the top. I want somebody who is thoughtful and, is going to see issues. Like,
it certainly betrays a really bad understanding of leadership.
Yeah, right.
And I don't know, like, one of the things I wonder is if she was writing so that you're always stacking the odds against the rebel faction by pointing out that their thinking has always been a little bit blinkered or flawed or selfish. But there are parts in this book where it really does feel like the deck is being stacked against Mark, period. Let me find I'm going through like my many, many Kindle notes at this point, because there's a passage in like the back quarter of the book, or the back fifth, where by this point, Jack has begun to, like, just all these intractable cancers have begun to pop up, and Mark puts him in like a little baby backpack and carries him around campus, and they talk about the meaning of life and X and Y and Z.
I love picturing that, by the way, like, just, Mark wandering around with his tiny little Jack, and yet they're having a conversation that's deeply philosophical. It's not what it looks like at all.
Yeah, because they argued about the validity of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the existence of God, and the notion that a thinking, responsible person with well-defined goals was still somehow obligated to trust God. So the two of them debate that. And then there's a line in this whole long passage, because they debate everything, we find that out. And at the end of it says, the brother minds were very different. They were natural antagonists by nature. And I read that, and I had to like go back and reread it again. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, you were really stacking the deck against Mark early on. Like, you're suggesting that there's something in his very nature that makes him unable to connect to Jack the Bodiless or understand where he's coming from. And I thought, oh my God, poor Mark. He's been predestined to be Lucifer, as it were. And then, like, a few chapters later, when Fury comes to visit him while he's practicing his little zippy bike thing, Fury pitches him the idea of, Fury wants Mark to be his new host, and he's like, you've dreamed of it. I've showed it to you. You're more than human. You're an angelic being, more powerful than the Lilmlick, unfettered by the tawdry limitations of flesh and blood, a being whose very essence is mine. And Mark is tempted, and he suffers, and he rebukes it. But the last image he sees before he rebukes is of this shimmering angel over the abyss. And we know, of course, later he's called the Angel of the Abyss, but the imagery is also extremely Lucifer-esque.
It really is. I hadn't put all of that together until this.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, like,
such pity for him.
I feel like this book has a very Judeo-centric telling of all of this. I mean, even when we're talking about Teresa and Jack and Rogie, this is when Teresa performs the Snow Queen, like that chapter kind of in there. Yeah. At the beginning of it, Teresa and Jack are discussing God and why he made the universe for love. And like it even says in there that we get this Judeo-centric view that Teresa has taken on, because the other religions, like it's
so strongly biased against anything other than the Judeo-Christian tradition. Yeah.
That other religions don't have loving gods, that the Judeo-Christian religious tradition is unique in having a God that is loving. And I find it, like, I am not a religious studies major in any stretch of the imagination, so maybe I'm wrong, but I find it really hard to believe that there aren't other religions somewhere in the world that have gods that love. Like, that just seems very strange to me.
Yeah, no, it's basically all of chapter 24 is Teresa justifying her faith.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, the bit where they talk about God becoming corporeal, because that is exactly what the Lilmic are doing, like right around this point in the book. They are trying on, or just earlier than that, they tried on some human bodies and drank some Labatts and stuff like that. We actually literally have entities becoming corporeal to try to see what it's more like to be a human being. And they happen to be the only race that has no incarnation myth. Just, okay.
Wonder why that might be. Yes. But yeah, it's, I feel like she tips her hand more through these 3 books. And this is not spoiling it, but she makes the same argument repeatedly in all 3, which is that it's a sin to believe that you can engineer perfection on Earth because it's simply not possible by mankind's flawed nature. And what I find really interesting is that by the end of the book, Jack has transcended humanity.
Yeah.
Like, they make that clear, and the whole business where he gets cancer everywhere, and he's, at the end of it, he's basically a brain in a Futurama jar before the sabotage. And then at the end of it, he's just this perfectly floating, self-sustaining brain, and he's the next step beyond humanity, and he's shaken off the imperfections of humanity and the weaknesses of the flesh, and he's ready to embrace, galactic unity and all of that. And you want to know what I was actually reminded of? Twilight.
Oh. Fascinating.
So one of the things, so I read Twilight. I haven't read the Twilight books more than once.
I've read them at least 3 times, but it was a long time ago. I had to give them away, so I'd stop reading them.
Yeah. So I'll cop to this, but one of the things that stood out for me when I read the books was Bella Swan is always like super fascinated by the vampires because they're graceful and beautiful, and they are more perfect than humans.
True.
And then when she becomes a vampire, there's like the chapters about how much she exults in being a more perfect version of herself. And the thing that's always just struck me about Twilight is it's just this brilliant metaphor for adolescence when you're like, my body is awful. Why can't I just get this done with already? And you come out the other side of adolescence as, you're still human, but you've the hormones have stopped bubbling, your brain has settled down a bit, you're fine. And in Twilight, you don't come out of adolescence, you come out of the human condition and into a new condition where like your senses are heightened and you're more graceful and you're more beautiful and you have special talents you didn't have. And throughout all of those books, there's just this authorial yearning to be free of the shackles of humanity, because then you can be your best self. Like, that was like one of the things I really took from the books and was like, oh my gosh. And like, I got that feeling here too, because Jack is sanctified over the course of the book. Like, we never find out that, like, literally no one is irritated that they have to wipe the bottom of a 9-month-old who's lecturing them on the nature of God. And even when he's dying of cancer, he's like incredibly, yes, I'm thinking my deep thoughts and good-natured and social. And like, he's born under unusual conditions. He suffers, he dies, he's resurrected as post-human over the course of the book. And like, that's something that May keeps returning to again and again, is how limiting humanity is.
It's interesting too that his suffering, for the most part, comes from the fact that humanity and his family are trying to fight against what's happening. He doesn't realize at first that his body is actually designed to do this. It has been designed by, God or whatever to disintegrate. And it would have done so gracefully if they would have not done all of these cancer treatments. So the fact that he lingered and had to suffer for so long was simply because they were fighting nature. They were fighting God.
Yes. It was the hubris of humanity.
Yep. Yeah. Speaking of his travails, there's one moment in this book that I really love, and that is toward the end when the kids come in to sing Christmas carols to him. And
yes.
the little kids, little 5-year-old Norman takes, all the kids, of course, take a peek behind what's in this giant machine. And he takes a peek, and Norman's just kind of like blasé about it. He's like, "You're really a mess in there, aren't you?" And I'm just like, out of the mouths of babes. He's not scared by it. He's just like very matter of fact. And if more people could have been like Norman, maybe Jack would have suffered less.
Yeah. I also appreciate the part with the roses where he like transmogrifies his waste material into roses for everybody. Yes. And I was like, okay, there's a little bit of humor because one of the things that I find, I wouldn't say difficult, but the Remoulades seem like a really humorless lot by and large. Mm-hmm. Like Rogie has a robust sense of humor. We all know about that. And there might be a few on the Rebel side, but they're mostly just very high-minded and important and serious and thinking their big thoughts. And I like when they're not thinking their big thoughts, but rather, taking amusement in things.
Yeah, it's rare. So it makes it, I think, all the more special when you get those moments like that.
This book is fantastic. Like I said, it's a great beach read, and it mashes like 8 genres into one. And it's also got these moments of pathos and heart, which keep you going too, because it's not like endless theological exposition as told by the mouths of babes, which I deeply appreciate. Like, it's what if the Kennedys but psychic? And you're like, oh, I can go with that. There were parts of the book where you realize like how evil, because for everybody who's reading, we're going to assume that you either read the book or you're going to read the book. We'll talk about what happened over the course of the book here. You come to realize that quote unquote Fury is this malignant Grandmaster class psychic. Nobody knows who he is, but he's got 5 young operant minds at his disposal who do this really toxic metaconcert called the Hydra. So there's like 5 child Hydras who become the Hydra. And we find out that Fury effectively recruited those 5 in utero babies at Victor's bedside to become the Hydra.
I feel like that was a well played out mystery because I didn't actually notice. I hadn't counted that there were 5 pregnant ladies at the bedside. So I was discovering who they were like as the book was dribbling out clues. That was fun.
Yeah, no, like the first time I read the book, I had to flip back and count 1, 2, and then look at the family tree and then notice that, oh yeah, they all have the same birth year. And I have such mixed feelings about the Hydra because on the one hand, they're written as such magnificent villains because these are children who murder the Hydra get together and murder one of the child Hydra's dads.
Yeah.
Which is pretty hideous. And they also get together and murder another one's sister. Mm-hmm. And poor Addie. I liked her.
Oh, she was so sweet.
Yes. She put grape jelly on Jack's pacifier. I love that detail about her. Like, she's just this very bossy, thoughtful, smart girl who gets zapped because the resentful little sibling doesn't like her. But at the same time, like, the thing that I can't quite wrap my brain around, because it's a great reveal, it's a great setup. Julian May is effectively arguing that fetuses are inherently moral beings who can make, like, life or death choices while in utero. Mm-hmm. Because Fury coaxes the fetuses that it's in their best interest to follow along with him before they're even born.
It's true.
And she sets them on that path, and they never have a chance. And I have a hard time reconciling that.
Well, I feel like in the world that she has built, it fits. I don't necessarily I wouldn't want to overlay this onto reality in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, she's definitely created quite the world here when it comes to all of the metapsychic ideas. And, you also have Jack, who is a fetus, who is able to make lots of very specific decisions, whether to show himself or not show himself to different people and have, these deep conversations. And obviously the 5 kids who became Hydra were not nearly as advanced as he was sort of cerebrally, but they certainly had, I guess, enough personality and self-awareness to make this kind of decision. And it's interesting that she clearly just decided that because they have made this decision because when they are so young, so early on, they can't ever change their mind about it, because there's never a moment of any one of those kids thinking better of things. There are kids who are just like, well, I don't want to do this right now because we could get caught. Like almost all of the hesitation just centers around not wanting to get caught or get in trouble in any way. It's not like any of them has a moral quandary about anything that they're doing. They think that what they're doing is the way to live, and they're fine with that. It's creepy.
It's like you said, you have to look at it in the context of the story. I just keep grappling with the idea of a morality that holds a fetus responsible for its moral choices. Mm-hmm. And like you said, they don't have any opportunity to have a moment of reckoning later on. And maybe I'd feel better about it if there had been one or two lines in the book that demonstrate one of the Hydra children beginning to waver and being beguiled or persuaded again when they're older. And you can see the manipulation, the continuous manipulation, or the way it's presented to them where they continuously choose to be part of Hydra. But the idea that these poor kids are doomed before they're born, I feel so bad for them.
Yeah.
I mean, they're terrible. They're terrible. Again, killing parents, killing siblings, they're doing terrible things. But at what point was it ever really their choice?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and she never really delves deeply into exactly what the mechanics were or exactly how it happened. So, I mean, did Fury do a conscience-ectomy on all of these kids? Like, were they altered somehow when they were in utero so that their personalities formed in a way that worked well for Fury's needs? I mean, maybe these children were, actually in effect attacked when they were still fetuses and came out the way they did simply because they literally weren't given a choice because their minds were redacted to some extent by Fury. But again, we don't really know. So like that has to be headcanon on my part to sort of make me feel a little bit better about it.
I just really, I was not surprised. I think I had forgotten how much I enjoyed this world. Mm-hmm. There are so many details to it. I enjoyed seeing what might have been like authorial bugbear resolved in her world, for example. I find it notable that she bags on Victor's particular house by talking about how tasteless it was. And then later when she talks about, what is the name of the town that Dartmouth is in?
Hanover?
In New Hampshire. Yes, thank you. She talks about how Hanover at this point is just this beautiful, picturesque little town again because all of the ugly parts of civilization have either been consigned to fantastic underground facilities or they've been retrofitted into beautifully historically restored buildings. Like there's no strip malls. And I was like, yes, in a world of progress, this is what it would look like. And then I thought, or is this somebody who like watched a field by her house go up for sale and then watched somebody put like a Blockbuster video on it? Was like, all right, in my world, when the aliens come, we will get rid of this.
And it's also a very specific person's idea of what is beautiful, and it's the older stately sort of thing. I mean, this book is, as were the previous books, this book is very ethnocentric when it comes to the one planet that they talk about the most is Denali, and like it's the one that we sort of care about the most. It's going to be populated by Americans and then Canadians, then Greenlanders, then any of the Arctic areas of Europe and maybe Asia. And it's like that's as white as they come when you're thinking about. And it
echoes her whole thing about how there are certain ethnicities that have higher levels of meta faculties. So of course it's all merit, you see.
Yes. We get that reminder too at the end when Hydra flees to Ela, and they this reminder that Celtic genes are very operant overall. So that's a great place for them to hide out.
Yes, it's the Russians and the Celts and the Franco and then the French Canadians, and there are arguments in the book because they're talking about voting and representation and settling, and it all comes down to populations, apportioned representation based on what percentage of their ethnic clade is operant. And I was like, oh my God.
Right? I mean, I was almost happy when one of the rebels comes in and it's a black woman from Africa, and she is pissed off that the white people are getting so many planets and Africa is getting very few. And I was like, yeah, you go, girl.
Well, I kept thinking, that makes about as much sense. Like, oh, well, clearly you have to debase the meta-faculties. And I'm like, okay, let's just say for a moment that United Nations representation is apportioned out based on, like, how many Olympic caliber marathon runners your people can produce.
Right? Like, what?
And I hope you really enjoy having Kenya run everything. They would do a fantastic job, I'm sure. But, like, just come on, look at the criteria you're using and ask who they benefit and how they perpetuate power structures. And she doesn't do that. Instead, it's just this, oh, well, it's merit and talent. And I'm like, it's not always merit and talent, though, man. You'd think that 5 alien races could figure that out.
It's sort of the macro level of what I was saying earlier about the rebels themselves. Oh, yeah, we want to put Mark in charge when he grows up because he has such a strong powers in his mind. Well, okay, on a galactic scale, we are going to take the people who have the most mind powers and put them in charge of things. Like, we saw what happened in the Pliocene era when people with really strong mind powers were in charge, and it wasn't all that great all the time.
Yeah, no, I think what I find really interesting about that is maybe what they're trying to say and not really saying is not, oh, Mark is a great leader because he's so strong, but rather Mark is a great leader because he's got a strong stomach. He'll do things we're too squeamish to do.
Well, that certainly follows.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's it. He's the least human of us, so he won't balk at things, and we can put all the responsibility on his shoulders.
Oh, the irony of choosing somebody who is the least human to defend the humans against the aliens.
Yeah. The arc that Mark goes through in this book, I feel like he's being set up here. It's predetermined. He and Jack will be in opposition, and it will be poignant because Mark is the one who fought for Jack to be born. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be that way. Mm-hmm. It's that way because the author wants to make it that way.
Which, I mean, that is the way books work.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just reacting. I'm like, really? Why? And again, this is the drawback of having an author who's been departed for quite some time is I would love to be able to ask her questions about this, like, why these themes? And did you write this because you one of the questions I would love to ask Julie and May is, did you choose to take a look at original sin and predestination because you didn't see a lot of that in science fiction, or because you thought these were really rich themes you could explore and you were comfortable doing that from a Catholic grounding? I don't recall very many other books that have taken the tack that she takes when it comes to the idea that we're a combination of free will and, chess pieces in God's three-dimensional chaotic chess. There's plenty of fantasies where oh, you're the chosen one because you've picked the frog out of the well and then you pulled a sword out of a stone and the prophecy says you have to do this, so good luck figuring that out. There's plenty of that, but this is a whole nother level. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to know how she was yes, I started this book about people who went back in time and dealt with a race of patently insane warrior elves. And now it's the psychic Kennedys.
What a trip, man. What a trip.
It is. How did she map it out and what prompted this? Because one of the other things that you come to here is the themes here are a lot more subtle, I think, in some ways, and a lot more human. Over the saga of the Pliocene exile, it's more rip-roaring adventure and clashes of civilizations and, a whole soup son of, well, that wasn't what I was expecting. And here, instead, it's basically a debate over what constitutes a civilization, or rather what constitutes an ethical civilization, and where do your moral choices begin and end? And are you comprised of your choices, or is there something above and beyond them? And those are much different themes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very lofty on one hand, and then very personal on the other hand. The stories here.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, this is just a perfect beach read.
Yeah. I noticed a couple of nifty things that reminded me of the previous era of books, the Pliocene Exile, some other stuff. They specifically mention in Chapter 5 that Davy McGregor had donated sperm for other planets. Yeah. And I was just aha, that is probably where Aiken Drum eventually springs from, because he is so strong, and David McGregor is like, he's the great enemy of Fury for a while there in the book. So I'm like, that
they have that chart in the back with the family trees where you actually see that.
Oh, I see. I hadn't even noticed that. I need to look at that. I haven't been looking at the chart too closely because I don't want spoilers.
No, yeah, they because I remember that when I saw that I was like, wait, what? And then went back and read. It's like, oh my gosh! Like as a teenager, oh wow,
totally makes sense. Also, there was the very brief moment when Mark is just about to, like, he's absconding with Teresa and Rogie, and like they go shopping in Denver, and then they go to Canada. And first of all, I laughed at the fact that they go to the Bay, which is now back to be, at the time that this was written, it was called the Bay, which is short for the Hudson's Bay Company, which is like the longest running store in North America. It's founded in like 1600 something or other, but it is back to now being called Hudson's Bay again here in Canada. And I was just like, Mark is surprised that it's just a regular department store. Like, I guess I kind of was too the first time I went there. But it's basically just like a nicer version of Sears. Rest Sears' soul. But Mark's moment where he looks at the fish that is mounted on the wall at the lodge where they eat, and like his immediate thought that we get it, it's like when we see the mind speak and it's all capitalized, it's just lust. And I was just like, okay, well, we definitely see that later in Mark's life, because when he has gone back to the
game fishing,
yeah. And then I'm thinking, oh, poor Hagen. Like someday
just thinking
Mark's son is gonna pay for that.
Yeah. Oh, there was another theme that she brings into this book that is, again, pretty deeply biblical in nature. And again, I don't know what she has against twins.
Oh, right.
But, you remember that there's this dynamic between Rogie and Dawn, where Dawn's like, let me in, and Mark's all, no! Not Mark, Rogie is all, no! And that's and then Dawn's hate leads to him warping Victor. So the crimes of that brotherly, schism are visited onto the generation following, right?
Yep.
And then the generation following includes Dennis. Dennis has Paul as their youngest child. Paul and Teresa. We find out, like in one of the chapters in the book, that Mark was not a singleton. He actually had a twin in utero. And there's a horrifying passage about this.
Yes.
Uncle Rogie told me this story in the bookshop one day when I caught him maudlin drunk and he didn't know what he was doing. He said that the two of his babies were mental antagonists almost from the first time we attained consciousness. Matt was born first, dead, and when I was born, they found my umbilical cord wrapped around my neck and my little hands locked in a vice grip on Matt's cord. Evidently, I cut off my twin's blood supply before he could finish throttling me.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And then Mark says he asks his father what happened after hearing the story, and it was never really clear. We twins learned to mind screen in the womb at 8 months. Matt was supposed to have been larger and mentally more powerful than me, and maybe he didn't like the competition.
That's like intense. And the fact that like it's mentioned 2 or 3 times before we find this out. Like there's that, Mark was a twin, and it was, and he was born under strange circumstances.
Yeah, and you're like, he didn't absorb him in the womb, did he? And they're like, no, worse, he murdered him. He murdered him when they were in labor.
Yeah. I mean, possibly in self-defense, but still, yowza.
Yeah. So you've got 3 generations. There are 4 generations in this book, because there's Rogie and Dawn, then there's Dennis's generation, then there's Paul's generation, there's Mark's generation, and the 3 out of those 4 generations you have intra-brother conflict that is fatal. I'm just like, and part of it is like, what on earth? Like, why twins, man? Like, what, or rather, why such intensity of sibling relationships that way?
I mean, maybe it is,
why is that all, one of her themes?
Maybe it is all supposed to be biblical, and this is just Cain and Abel over and over and over again.
Or Jacob and Esau, because there was that one too. Or Joseph and his brothers selling him into slavery, or like you said, it's
a theme.
On and on it goes. It's a theme. It's a theme. And apparently the rest of the family is like completely cool with this. Like they haven't cultivated an atmosphere of sufficient paranoia.
No.
I read that. I was like, ah. And then again, this has me wondering, and she'll never write this and no one ever will, but I'm now like wondering about like what the metapsychic OBGYN complex is like.
Oh my goodness. That's gotta be like real wild.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm wondering, what is labor like? I mean, they did have the depiction of Teresa giving birth to Jack, but Jack is special. We all know that.
Mm-hmm. And even with Jack being special, like he was frightened of it. I mean, in part because he thought he was going to be attacked during labor, and he was. But it wasn't like just because he was so advanced, he got away with not being in pain and having to deal with the trauma of labor. Like that only happens when you go back 6 million years and have Mercedes figuring out her, pain-free way to give birth, which apparently was against the laws of nature because, she got punished for it.
Of nature. Yeah, I was going to say it's and again, to get back to Julian May's leitmotifs, it's also really telling here that the one mother who features pretty prominently in this book and is identified primarily as a mother is Teresa, who is portrayed as a mostly vague and indifferent mother until Jack comes along. Mm-hmm. And even then, she lets her own business and her own emotions and her own travail, she lets that take precedence over being a parent. And then when she kills herself, she tries to take Jack with her.
Yeah.
And
flashbacks to Kieran O'Connor's mom there a little bit.
Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I found myself wondering, have we had a character in these books yet who has managed to be a mother and not be monstrous in some way, shape, or form?
I'm racking my brain. I mean, Sunny certainly wasn't. Like, she tried to be a good mom, but she let a lot of stuff slide. So real bad things happened.
Sunny made choices there.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. She sure did. And
then there's Elaine, who got brainwashed by Dawn and was kind of...
Or Shannon.
Shannon. Oh, Shannon was terrible, remember?
Oh, yeah. She was awful. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you had all that codswallop about how, well, with creative energy in women, they just channel into childbearing, whereas men get to do fun things. And I'm all, really? This is, we're still going to go with that? Because it seems like some of the implication is that because Teresa was also a creative person and an artist, that by default made her a bad parent.
It did. Yeah, you're right.
I was like, ooh, this is icky. And I don't know if it's like Julian May working out some stuff about the fact that she was a writer and a parent. But she seemed to do it really well. Like, she cranked up book after book after book after book. But it's just so weird to have that message percolate through the book.
Yeah.
And the other motherhood thing that gets brought up in the book, and I freely admit I'm touchy about this because I'm reading these now from the perspective of somebody who is, living the balancing act, as it were. But the other mother who gets mentioned in the book is Catherine, the Remillard sister, the youngest one, who's married to what is his last name? The one who gets zapped by this kid.
Brett.
Brett. Yeah, she's McAllister. Yeah. So she wants to drop back from her work so she can spend more time with Brett, and Brett is supporting that. And then boom, Brett gets eliminated and she can go back, and it's all very convenient. Mm-hmm. But she's also portrayed as somebody who's just kind of middling at best at what she does. Mm-hmm. And I'm all, oh, come on!
Yeah, and we really don't get a lot. I mean, yes, we have 5 pregnant women in the room at the beginning of the book, and those kids become Hydra.
And then they leave the room.
Yeah. Like, we never get any real information about how they are as mothers and what the upbringing of these children is. And some of them have other children, some of them have many other children. So it's not like, there's not an implication that it's the mother's fault that Hydra happened. But we also don't get any information about, whether they are... there are too many moms and there are too many kids to actually delve into all of the, family relationships for each and every one of them in this book. But it is now that you bring it all out, it is a little disturbing that the relationships that we do focus on, there's no example of a nurturing and successful mother-child relationship.
No, there's not. Or there's no example of a relationship in which a woman is more than merely a procreative vessel, where she can be both a person who chooses to have a family and chooses to have a career, and those things complement each other rather than work in conflict with one another.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm reading this through my distinctly 21st century eyes and grumbling, and maybe I don't know or cannot understand what it would have been like to have been a working artist and dealing with the pressures of parenthood back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s like Julian May was. I don't know. I can't know that, but reading it now, I'm like, I don't like this.
Also, speaking of reading it through the current lens, at the end of the book, Jack has finally, discorporated, and he is just the floating brain. And I really feel that, like, Rogi's thoughts at the end just feel to me really insulting. The idea that Rogi's mourning for Jack because who could ever love him? And, he follows it up and says, oh, how the family ghost must have laughed because, we're meant to know that eventually he's going to find love anyway. But to me, it's insulting to think that Jack even needs carnal or romantic love. Like, that is such an allocentric viewpoint. And like, I have many friends that I just like think of and be like, how would they feel reading this book? Being Arrow or Ace, and just, that gut punch of a last, like, couple lines there being like, yeah, nobody's ever going to love him, so what a terrible life he's going to have. No.
I wonder if it's supposed to be you're seeing it through Rogi's biases.
Yes, and that is, I tried to take that away. I tried.
Yeah, and he's such a creature. He's a baby boomer.
He is.
This is
true.
The thing, is he's a baby boomer. So you're seeing this through his perspective, and I'm not clear if the authorial intent was to demonstrate that you're simply going to have ideas that don't keep up with the times. Because at the time when Julian May was writing this, it's not like Arrow and Ace people just spontaneously popped into existence when Tumblr came online. Like
right.
But I would hazard a guess that back when she was writing this, the social fictions that people had were along the lines of, oh, they're married to their job, or they just never found the right person, or they've always been, they're a confirmed bachelor. They seem to really love their spinster life, or what have you, right? Everyone was just like, everyone implied that, they're single or not in a procreative relationship because they've made other choices. Whereas now you might be like, oh, well, that's just not how they're wired.
Yep.
So, she didn't know and she didn't write. And what I wonder is if Rogi is supposed to be a relic of his time, like intentionally, or if, he comes off that way to us because we have moved past the mindset that Julian May was writing with and to at the time.
Yeah. It's also interesting, too, that, like, Rogi is so long-lived because of the, like, infinity gene that they have, that the end of this book takes place way, like, even still in our future. It's 2054 when Earth's probation is over, and yet we started reading about Rogi back in, what was it, like the 50s or something like that?
1954, yeah.
Yeah. So he could very easily be a throwback to a time that is past, and it's a time that's past for us and for the characters in the book because it spans such a huge, he's real old at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm trying to imagine if I was talking to somebody who's 100 years old at this point, they would have had to been born in the 1870s. And
wow.
Well, yeah. And imagine the attitudes that they grew up with. And, I would honestly be astonished if they like considered Hawaii a state. People have a hard time changing minds and attitudes. What was really striking was, and this is like a couple of years ago, I was on a rafting trip and I was talking to a couple behind me, and I was asking, we were talking about where we came from. And long story short, there was a country in the southern end of the African continent that had one specific name when the British colonists were still there, and has since changed its name, and they were still calling it by the name that the colonists had given it. And their defense was, well, this is where I grew up. So this is the country I grew up in. This is how I recognize it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, really? But this is what they thought of. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. So, yeah.
So, Rogi would be the same way, where he would probably have attitudes that he couldn't quite grok, because it would simply be out of his realm of understanding or his frame of reference.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I do know plenty of people who are old to elderly who have changed their opinions on things vastly over the years. Oh, yeah. So it's definitely a person-to-person thing.
Yeah, it's more personality, I would say, than anything else.
And we have established that Rogi, even as a young man, was a cranky old man. That's just Rogi.
This is true. He was. That poor guy. I think all he ever really wanted was just to live an unbothered life in New Hampshire.
Yep. Mm-hmm. He did not get that.
No. My theology is vastly imperfect, but what I would love to do is find somebody who, did know their biblical studies inside and out, and ask them how they would teach these books and map them onto the Judeo-Christian Bible and the lessons that Julian May is clearly drawing on here. Because I think we have to say 7 books in that this is effectively like this is effectively a religious text in some ways.
Mm-hmm. It really is. And it's not subtle about it.
No.
But as I've said before, I didn't pick up any of that the first time I read it, because that was just not the world I came from. I didn't grow up in any religious study at all. So it was just science fiction with aliens and, interactions between families and political machinations, and that was all I saw. I'm definitely reading it with a completely new lens this time, and I think it's actually a lot more interesting to read it with more understanding of what's going on all the way through it.
Yeah. So I've had difficulty sustaining concentration on books for the last 6 months. Can't imagine why. Oh. And it's gotten better because, again, reading's a muscle and you have to build it up over time. So I've just been cross-training, for lack of a better word. And one of the ways I kind of cross-trained to get back up to it was I started reading just trashy celebrity biographies and autobiographies, just no redeeming value whatsoever. Things like the rivalry between Lee Radziwill and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And that actually dropped me into a wormhole on Kennedy family biographies. And the more I read them, the more strongly I was reminded of the Remillard family, with everything from their hardscrabble beginnings to the vast extended clan to in the case of the Kennedys, they have vast utility company holdings in Massachusetts, and the Remillards, they had vast industrial holdings. The idea that there's this competitive atmosphere growing up. There's this big, family loyalty comes first, but people in the family can be brutal to each other. Anyway, I was joking that, this is basically what if the Kennedys but psychic? And now the more I've read my trashy biographies, the more I'm like, oh, that's actually a really good log line. Kennedys but psychic.
Oh, man.
And they're political too, so it gets right in there.
It really does. Yes, of course, yeah. They're automatically political because they have very strong metapsychic faculties.
Yes.
And that's how it works. Anything else you want to cover before we ride off into the sunset?
No, this is such a great beginning of a trilogy. I like how it calls back to the previous 6 books, but this is such a great kickoff to a trilogy. And I so enjoyed reading it. How about you?
Yeah, I think that she did, sometimes the first book in a trilogy feels like it's furniture moving and it's set up. And I don't necessarily mind that because I like that kind of stuff very much. But that is not for everybody. And this book does not feel like that. This book feels like it is its own bits of the story. Everything that's happening in it is propulsive. I'm reading it and I'm interested in what's going on. And when you get to the end of it, you realize, yes, definitely there are pieces that have been moved into places and they are ready to go on to do other things. But I don't feel like the fact that that is the case takes away from any of the stuff that happened beforehand. I was interested in all of it. I feel like everything kind of made sense within the arc of the book itself, and that, you know, the next books are going to build on it as opposed to the next books kicking off the action or starting the action. So I'm good with it.
And I have such faith with what she'll do next, because we've already seen that she knows how to pace out a story and tell it. Mm-hmm. So...
yeah. And like I have said before, I remembered bits and pieces, and it seems like all of the bits and pieces that I remembered were in this book. And the only thing I remember is I think I remember little bits of one stuff that's happening on one of the planets in maybe the next book and being very bored by it. So it'll be interesting to see if I still come away with that same reaction or not. So who knows?
Yeah, I'm kind of excited because the next book stresses a female protagonist. Mm-hmm. And we haven't really had one of those. Like, we did have Elizabeth in the Pliocene saga, but by and large, most of the debates and most of the action tended to center around like Mark or Aiken, or the cast of characters like Basil's Bastards. So I'm really excited to see what she does with a female metapsychic at the center of things.
Mm-hmm. And it is not a spoiler to say that, because the book is called Diamond Mask and we already know who she is. So
Yes. She's mentioned as a saint along with Jack, so we have to see how that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, it's not superhero origin stories. It's, religious saint origin stories that we're getting in these books.
Yes, the stories of the lives of the saints.
Yep. All right. Well, this has, of course, been a delight. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm so glad we're doing this.
Yeah. All right. Well, I am Erica.
And I'm Lisa.
And thank you once again for joining us on this epic journey. Saga of Rereading Epics is a proud part of the Incomparable Podcast Network. Visit theincomparable.com for more geeky podcasts. And while you're there, you can become a member, support the show, and get future episodes of this podcast right now.